In the northern highlands of Burkina Faso, the wind carries dust like memory, fine, persistent, impossible to silence. It was here, near the Malian border, that a group of shepherd boys stumbled upon something that would unravel decades of denial. A shallow grave, then another, then 32 more. The bones bound at the wrists, skulls fractured by blunt force. No record in UN archives, no mention in French or American reports. Yet from the red earth, something else surfaced. A corroded metal tag, bearing the faded insignia of a US mining contractor that had vanished from public record decades ago. When President Ibrahim Traoré arrived at the site, he didn't bring a delegation, only silence. Cameras captured him standing before the open pit, face unmoving, the heat distorting the air around him. Then, after several moments, he spoke softly. History speaks quietly when it has been gagged. Today we remove the gag. He ordered the site excavated. Within hours, messages began circulating through diplomatic channels. Halt the excavation. Wait for verification. Avoid inflammatory interpretation. The international observers argued there was no official record of conflict in the area, no contextual frame for such violence. Traoré's response was broadcast live. You buried them once. You will not bury the truth again. The following morning, villagers and students gathered at dawn. Under a sky streaked with early light, the earth began to open. Shovel by shovel, bone by bone, 51 skeletons emerged. Men, all of them young, all of them bound. Forensic reports indicated signs of torture, execution, and professional disposal. A forensic pathologist from Senegal noted the pattern. The remains bore evidence of military footwear, specifically an imprint consistent with an American combat boot model issued in the late 1960s. But the records didn't match. No rebel camp had ever existed there. No battle, no local uprising. The only document remotely connected was a Cold War-era memorandum granting mineral exploration rights in Zone D, a desolate stretch overlapping this exact site. Local elders remembered it differently. They came with machines, said one man, his voice breaking. They promised work, then soldiers came, then silence. In the capital, pressure began to mount. Traoré ordered a truth dossier, a full review of all resource contracts between 1960 and 1980. Many had been signed not by governments, but by military juntas, puppet regimes installed or influenced by external powers. Within 48 hours, representatives from donor nations began arriving in Ouagadougou, urging restraint. These excavations, one ambassador warned, risk destabilizing historic partnerships. Traoré replied, "If the truth burns your eyes, it is because you helped light the fire." Within days, the phrase became a rallying cry. Across West Africa, archives opened. Retired officials came forward. In Mali, a former miner posted letters from missing co-workers who vanished in 1974. In Ghana, shipping records surfaced showing unregistered mineral exports linked to defunct Western corporations. But still, international headlines remained scarce. No editorials, no official inquiries, only whispers inside think tanks, foreign ministries, and corporate boardrooms, wondering whether the ghosts of the Cold War had finally learned to speak. Inside Burkina Faso, universities launched courses under a new discipline, mineral memory, the study of resource exploitation through oral testimony. A youth collective released a short film titled "The Earth Remembers Us," and when the remains were reburied, wrapped not in plastic bags but in ancestral cloth, Traoré said only, "We will not weaponize their story, but we will no longer swallow silence for peace." Weeks later, his government unveiled Echoes of the Earth, a digital archive declassifying every colonial and post-colonial mining contract ever signed on Burkinabe soil. Within 72 hours, 500,000 downloads flooded the servers. Researchers in Brazil and South Africa began connecting dates, signatures, and clauses. One document stood apart. A 1971 contract between a US company and the then regime of Upper Volta, granting exclusive extraction and security privileges in a radius that perfectly matched the grave site. Proof not of intent but of indifference. The backlash was immediate. Western embassies issued quiet complaints. Aid disbursements were delayed. NGOs suddenly paused programs citing political instability. French media dismissed the excavation as a symbolic performance, but something irreversible had begun. In Ouagadougou, posters appeared overnight, wheat pasted to walls reading, "We were not silent, you just never listened." Traoré addressed parliament. "We cannot live in a house of independence if its foundation is built on stolen bones." Across the continent, resonance spread. Indigenous communities in Brazil shared maps of unmarked graves near foreign gold concessions. Filipino miners' widows posted letters of solidarity. A Namibian elder wrote, "We too have ghosts, and now we know we are not alone." For the first time in decades, Africa was no longer pleading for recognition. It was asserting memory as sovereignty. By early November, a new structure began to rise at the burial site. A circular monument of local stone, open to the sky. No names, no flags, only silence. And one inscription, carved in both French and Moor. They lived. They are not forgotten. It was named the Silent Memorial. When international journalists asked why he had built it without Western consultants, Traoré said simply, "We are no longer outsourcing our grief." The morning the Silent Memorial was completed, the air in Ouagadougou felt heavier, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The monument had no official unveiling, no orchestral fanfare, only villagers and families who came carrying small stones wrapped in cloth, tokens for those who never came home. At its center stood a single wooden bench, carved from local teak, inscribed with the words, "We do not demand vengeance, we demand to be remembered." President Ibrahim Traoré stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, his jacket dusted with red earth. He didn't speak, not then. But the silence spread across borders like wind over dry grass. In Dakar, students held vigils. In Nairobi, professors began drafting research papers. In Paris, an editor rejected a journalist's request to cover the story, saying, "There's no geopolitical angle." But that was precisely what made it dangerous. It was moral, not political. Within weeks, Burkina Faso took its next step. At a midnight press briefing, Traoré's government announced a project called the Atlas of Silence. A digital map, simple, almost understated. Pale background, red dots marking every known or suspected site of extractive violence across Africa. Villages razed, miners disappeared, forests stripped under foreign concessions. No accusations, no rhetoric, just data, testimony, and soil samples. The world's reaction was divided. African universities offered to contribute oral histories. Latin American activists began sharing parallels from Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador. But in Brussels and Washington, policy briefings began to circulate under cautious titles. The Remembrance Wave, Emerging Risks to Strategic Partnerships. One diplomat was overheard saying, "He's building an emotional empire." The pushback was subtle but relentless. A consortium of Western donors temporarily suspended aid to Burkina Faso, citing budgetary realignment. Two major development projects were quietly withdrawn. A coordinated campaign of anonymous accounts began flooding social media, accusing the government of fabricating evidence. Satellite photos were doctored, videos mislabeled, but the countermeasures failed to silence the movement. In universities across the continent, students began forming memory circles, small groups meeting weekly to document forgotten histories of their towns, mines, and vanished relatives. Local radio programs aired testimonies from families who had never before spoken publicly. And then, one day, a letter arrived at the presidential palace, handwritten, unsigned. It contained a military unit patch, bleached and frayed, from a U.S. engineering team stationed in Upper Volta during the 1970s, and a confession. "We were told to secure the zone. I saw the pits. I saw the bodies. We were ordered to forget. But some memories refused to die." Traoré did not release the letter publicly. Instead, he visited the Silent Memorial that evening, under an orange dusk. Witnesses said he stood there alone for over an hour. Then he said quietly, "We asked for memory, not revenge." But the storm was already brewing. Within the next month, several Burkina-based civil society leaders reported visa denials when trying to attend academic conferences abroad. A prominent anthropologist who had written in support of the Atlas of Silence lost his European research funding. One donor nation abruptly recalled its ambassador for consultations. It was the oldest diplomatic weapon of all, isolation. Inside the cabinet, some urged restraint. "We are too small to fight them," one minister warned. "They control the ports, the loans, the stories." Traoré listened, then pointed to the digital map glowing on the wall. The Atlas, now covered with red dots spreading from Africa into South America and Southeast Asia. "If I am isolated for listening to the dead," he said, "let them make silence louder than memory." Within weeks, the Atlas of Silence was translated into 12 languages. Indigenous groups in Canada contributed data from forgotten boarding schools. A collective in Bolivia added markers from unacknowledged massacres of miners during US-backed regimes. Even in Europe, anonymous submissions began to appear. Descendants of colonial officers confessing what their families had hidden for generations. The movement was no longer about Africa. It was about authorship. Who gets to write history and who gets erased? In response, Western state media declared the project revisionist. Think tanks called it a moral populism threatening stability. One prominent outlet published an op-ed titled, "The Dangers of Weaponizing the Past." But history was already weaponized. It had always been. In mid-November, a leaked internal memo from a European development agency revealed discussions to reassess engagement with destabilizing historical movements. The phrasing was clinical, detached, yet it confirmed what everyone suspected. Truth, when inconvenient, was still treated as subversion. But inside Burkina Faso, something deeper was taking root. Communities once divided by ethnicity, class, or language began sharing a single vocabulary: remembrance. Elders who had never spoken publicly before traveled miles to record testimonies for the atlas. Youth collectives produced audio archives, translating grief into permanence. Then, another ripple. A teacher in Mali uploaded an old mining payroll register, showing dozens of employees marked relocated. A journalist in Kenya discovered declassified memos revealing British awareness of forced labor camps. Everywhere, dots on the map began to multiply, turning red into constellations. The West could no longer ignore it. In private, embassies began sending reports titled "The Memory Movement." It was no longer dismissed as symbolic. It was strategic, a challenge to the monopoly of narrative. On November 25th, Traoré announced a new event, the Summit of Remembrance and Accountability. It would be hosted in Ouagadougou before the end of the year. Delegates from nations with histories of extractive exploitation across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia would attend. No Western governments were invited. The statement was calm, almost poetic. "We need a table where the ghosts of our past are not foreign policy footnotes." The reaction was instant. Major media outlets accused him of building an anti-Western alliance. Policy think tanks warned of geopolitical fragmentation. The markets responded predictably. The Burkinabe currency slipped. Investors hesitated. But among the people, something else was stirring. In Bolivia, students formed human chains spelling out the phrase, "Memory is not a weapon." In Windhoek, Namibia, survivors of colonial-era forced labor walked in silent procession holding photos of their ancestors. In Sri Lanka, fishermen's unions released a statement of solidarity, recalling forgotten wartime disappearances. For the first time, global memory had found its rhythm. Burkina Faso, small and often overlooked, had become the drumbeat. By late November, the summit preparations were underway, built not by contractors, but by volunteers, local architects, university historians, villagers who brought wood, fabric, and stones. There was no budget, no sponsorship, only conviction. When a reporter asked Traoré what he hoped to achieve, he replied, "Justice does not always begin in courtrooms. Sometimes it begins when a people remember together." Outside, a mural appeared overnight on a government wall. It showed a woman holding a lantern over a grave, the light spilling outward in waves. Beneath it, the words, "We are the children of what was taken." The day the Summit of Remembrance and Accountability began, Ouagadougou felt unlike itself. There were no flags, no red carpets, no motorcades. The air was thick with anticipation and the dry scent of dust and rainless clouds. Delegates from 40 nations gathered under a vast open-air canopy made from woven cloth and timber beams. There were no anthems, only silence, broken by the faint hum of distant cicadas. They came from places the global stage had long ignored. War archivists from Vietnam, indigenous activists from Brazil, midwives from Haiti, historians from Sri Lanka, poets from Palestine. Not a single Western government was represented, and that was intentional. As President Ibrahim Traoré put it, "We are not here to settle scores. We are here to settle silence." He spoke only 14 minutes. The words were deliberate, heavy, and quiet enough to make every camera hold its breath. Then he unveiled what would define the summit, a massive hand-painted map stretching 20 meters wide. No political borders, no capitals, only shaded regions of land marked with thin black circles. the sites of exploitation, massacres, and unacknowledged disappearances from the colonial and post-colonial eras. It was titled The Cartography of Loss. Some in the audience wept. Others simply stared, unmoving. A few walked out, unable to bear what the image demanded them to see. For the rest, it became a mirror. The summit's agenda, once logistical, became emotional. Testimonies replaced speeches. An elderly woman from the Congo spoke first. Her voice trembled as she described watching her father taken by soldiers guarding a Belgian mine when she was 7 years old. "They said he was being relocated for work," she said. "We found his boots years later in the mud." A miner's widow from Chile described the contracts her husband had been forced to sign under a military junta backed by foreign investors. A poet from Palestine read verses about erasure. A Namibian archivist laid copies of declassified German military orders from the early 1900s on the table. For 3 days, the summit transformed into something no institution had ever dared attempt: a collective exorcism of silence. There were no resolutions, no treaties, no signatures. Only conversations that were never before permitted to exist. Outside the canopy, crowds gathered in the streets, not to protest, but to witness. People held candles and old mining helmets, stood shoulder to shoulder, and repeated a single phrase in dozens of languages. "We are the children of what was taken." By the second night, the global response began to fracture. Major Western outlets struggled to frame the event. Some called it an ideological gathering. Others dismissed it as theatrical symbolism. But a few independent journalists saw it for what it was: a rewriting of the moral architecture of global history. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country once defined by foreign aid and dependency, had done something radical. It had reclaimed authorship. During the summit's final session, Traoré addressed the delegates again. His tone was soft, but the meaning cut through the air like a blade. "We are told that remembering divides us," he said, "but it was forgetting that made us subjects. If we must choose between unity and truth, then we choose truth, for only then can unity mean something." When the summit ended, there were no closing ceremonies. Delegations left quietly, carrying not agreements, but seeds, ideas. Bolivia's representatives vowed to add oral history to their national curriculum. Namibia pledged to create local memory councils led by elders. Haiti's midwives promised to record birth stories from generations born under occupation. None of these were political demands. They were declarations of existence. And still, the backlash persisted. Financial institutions hinted at tightening credit access. A European foreign ministry labeled the summit a symbolic insurgency. Western think tanks began referring to Burkina Faso as a case study in narrative sovereignty. The phrase was meant as critique, but Traoré understood its deeper truth. In a televised reflection broadcast weeks later, he said, "Power is not only in weapons or wealth, it is in who controls the story. For too long we have lived inside other people's footnotes. Today, we write our own chapter." By January, the effects had rippled across the global south. In Namibia, a new memorial was built from rusted mining tools instead of marble. In Sri Lanka, an NGO launched an archive documenting unrecorded wartime disappearances. In Guatemala, survivors of the 1980s massacres held vigils under the name Echoes of the Earth. And then something remarkable happened. Quietly, almost imperceptibly. In a university in London, a group of students from Africa and Latin America organized a symposium called Memory as Resistance. Their keynote was not a politician, but a young Burkinabe historian who said, "When you erase history, you don't erase pain, you only erase accountability." The ripple had reached the empire's core. Back in Burkina Faso, the silent memorial became more than a site. It became a pilgrimage. Survivors from Angola, widows from Sierra Leone, displaced miners from Zimbabwe, all came, carrying soil from their homelands to mix with the earth of the graves. No speeches, no demands, only presence.